So before I begin, I'll say that whatever I say here, I don't represent anyone but myself. My views are not representative of NUS or the Department of Political Science. This is not to indemnify me, it's to indemnify my employers. So if anything, this is what these disclaimers are supposed to do. So if anyone gets in trouble, it will be me and not them, right? The other thing that I wanted to highlight before I begin is that I said this to Jeanette, and I'll let you guys know now, I'm actually not very comfortable talking about the elected presidency in this context because, as you all know, under the terms of reference for looking at the elected presidency, we have to look at minority issues. But what you have here are two middle-class Chinese men that are talking about an office whose powers pertain to minority issues, and there's not enough representation there, and also the fact that there's not enough. I know Jeanette does a very good job, but there is also not enough gender representation in the I guess the people who are on the sort of panel here, and that's something that I regret lah. Okay, just to get that out there. So actually, Kevin left me with a sort of very good starting off point because he's talking about this matrix that he has, and what I'm going to do is slightly different from Kevin. So he gave you the historical background. He talked about the Constitution and sort of legal aspects. What I do as a political scientist is I look at institutional design. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit more about these institutional aspects, about how these sort of features might actually work. And one of the things that I will be doing is to specifically look at the sort of where you have the quote unquote bad government, bad president area. There's a particular reason why I'm doing that, because if we think about institutions, right, we like to think about institutions that are robust. So institutions that are robust are those that tend to be able to weather conditions when the situation is bad, when things are not going according to what you prefer, right? Those institutions that are able to still function well in spite of bad conditions tend to be more robust. So I would like to direct your thinking a little bit about towards thinking about the robustness of our presidency, right? And what might happen when you get disagreements between the administration. I'll call, for clarity, I will call the ruling party of the administration as opposed to the government, because sometimes we confuse the government as in the state as opposed to the ruling party. So I'll just refer to as administration in the same way that you might call something like the Obama administration, right? The ruling party. So just to make that distinction. Okay. And where I begin is actually on values. It's not something that we talk about in politics a lot in Singapore. We don't tend to think about politics as a values-based process, but in some respects it is. And this includes the political process in Singapore. Because what we do when we think about institutions is that there are certain things that we prefer, certain things that we tend to be more afraid of, and these are sort of value-based judgments, right? For instance, we tend to think about one of the things that Kevin mentioned, and that tends to raise a red flag here, is this idea about gridlock. Oh, if things become slow, it's a big problem. Well, that's a value-based judgment, because there's an assumption, right, that a slower process is necessarily bad. It has to be pejorative, has to be gridlock. That may not be the case, right? Because you can imagine a situation where you may want more deliberation on an issue. You may want to take things a little bit slower. This is where the president acting as a brake, right, can be quite useful. Because the way you want to consider this is perhaps to think about, if you were to sit in an airplane, right, you want the technologies to be well tested, to be robust, not something that someone came up a month before and put together. Or if you're going to take a drug, right, you're going to take some medication, you presumably will want this medication to be tested, to pass certain safety standards, rather than just pop a pill, right? So that same mindset may apply to certain aspects of politics, right? And so I guess where we like to think about governments in general is, and this pertains to the presidency, is when we think about how we want to separate the powers of governance, right? The usual way we think about things is, okay, there's a judiciary, so they interpret the laws. There's a legislature, they make the laws. And then there's the executive, right? And the executive implements the laws. This is the sort of general, very basic separation of powers concept that we have. the presidency in Singapore is a bit different. It's custodial, meaning to say that it's supposed to watch over primarily spending, but also other issues like minority rights and things like religious harmony. So it sort of has a watchdog role. That's a bit different, right, from presidencies elsewhere. Okay, so I suppose this announcement that there will be a commission to review the presidency is a very good opportunity for us to think about what the presidency is in Singapore, where we may want it to go, what kind of presidency or political system we may want more broadly. Of course, we may not be able to get there, but it does help spur that kind of thinking. So, with the presidency in view, let me just touch on a few things that Kevin had brought up and highlighted a little bit more, which is, if you think about all the powers that are given to the president, right? I talked about the custodial role. The president has no power to actively initiate anything. Our president is sort of a brake, right? Our president acts as a brake on decisions made by the executive, made by a cabinet, right? The administration of the day. So, if the administration chooses to use reserves or the reserves of one of the statutory boards like the CPF or the HDB that during its term in office it did not accrue, well, the president can say no. Well, we need to stop there. You can't use that kind of money. When it comes to making laws, Kevin didn't touch on this, but our president is listed as being part of the legislature formally. So what that means to say is that the president plays a role in lawmaking. So the president, not just in terms of the person, but the entire office. So this would include things like the Presidential Council of Minority Rights and the Council of Presidential Advisors. So with the Council of Minority Rights, any bill that gets passed as a law in our parliament, right, has to go through the Council of Minority Rights to see that the bill does not impinge on the rights of any minority defined racially, our sort of CMIO model, right? And the Council of Minority Rights has 30 days to look through the bill, and if it decides, okay, there's no impinging on any particular minority, then it will give its assent, and the bill will go through and get gazetted and become law. Okay. So in that sense, the presidency does provide a break on. It slows down the legislative process. In terms of the other I won't go through all of them, but the other power of appointment, right, of key civil service personnel, like say the Chief of Defence Force, like the head of the public service, the president can, on advice of the Council of Presidential Advisors, block an appointment, right? If the president and the Council of Presidential Advisors disagree, then that decision will have to go back to Parliament. I think there has to be a 2/3 majority vote to pass through the appointment. Now, this again is a way to put a brake, right, on the discretionary powers of the administration to make appointments. So basically, what you see is the president's powers focus on slowing things down. This, in some respects, raises several questions for us, and I can talk about this a little bit more. But where I think, if you think about what the president can do, then one of the issues that comes up is, well, if slowing things down is something that we need to consider, right? So far I've talked about deliberation, slowing things down is something that's not so bad, but we also have this sort of constant concern in our minds about gridlock. So can you get into a situation where the president and either the Council of Presidential Advisors or the Parliament, they disagree on appointments, on the drawdown of reserves? And would this be gridlock? Would it be a good thing if the president sort of withholds his assent to an appointment, for instance, and then that appointment then needs to go through Parliament? Well, that means that whoever gets a top civil service appointment actually needs the legislature to effectively confirm his position. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Now, there are no, as I said, these are sort of normative value-based judgments. There's no quick answer to this. it's something that I hope you guys will think about a little bit more. Just to caveat what I've said, I mean, if you think about the US presidential system where basically what's equivalent to our ministers, all the secretaries are appointed by the president, they have to go through a confirmation process in the Senate, right? So you want to think about the problems that it raises. You do have problems with confirmation, and you also want to consider at the same time the benefits of that kind of system where there's some kind of review of the credentials of the sort of top appointees to various positions. Okay, so if that sort of tension between the presidency and this issue of appointments and the using reserves is one issue. Another point that I touched on just now is that, and also Kevin had raised, is quite a few number of matters, including this issue of appointments, the president has to act on the advice. Sound nice like advice, but it's really he has to sort of seems to have to follow what the CPA tells him. That there are some provisions if the Council of Presidential Advisors and the president disagree, then this has to go through subsequent review. This raises the question of what do we do with the Council of Presidential Advisors? They seem to be a body that has a lot of power, that has a lot of influence. Well, who are these people then? If you look at the Constitution, basically it's one person that gets appointed by the president. Two persons by the president, two by the prime minister. Then you have the chief justice. And you have the chairman of PSC appointing people to this position. Then the question would be, well, if the president is supposed to be a check on the administration, but then the administration gets to appoint people on the Council of Presidential Advisors that then advises the president what to do, then where does this sort of slowing down process work? How it's not entirely clear, and that's something that I think perhaps this commission would move towards resolving, because one of the things it does talk about is to look at the CPA. So I mean, it's really about raising questions pertaining to the presidential system that I'm trying to do. Things that are not really that clear in my mind. Perhaps it's clearer in yours, but at the very least, perhaps you can try to talk about a little bit more. And then there are a few other issues here which I like to highlight. Another is the question of about the office, about sort of these tweaks to the Constitution that we may be looking at in terms of changing the role of the presidency. And this again gets us back to another view of what our Constitution ought to be. This gets back to the way that you value the political system and what a Constitution ought to be. So it's ought to be, it's not should, right, or has to be. One view is that, well, if a Constitution is supposed to, and the sort of officers that entails and all that, it's supposed to be the sort of basic set of rules of the game in our political system, rules of the road in our political system. If it represents the basic common understandings that we ought to have as citizens in terms of what our political system is, then there's the question of well, how do you want to treat constitutional change? Kishore Mahbubani, in a recent article on the presidency, the way he talked about the changes to the presidency was in terms of policy. That's certainly one way you can look at it. So you look at changing the Constitution just like you would change any other law, any other policy. You make tweaks as necessary. Certainly, that allows a certain degree of nimbleness and flexibility to your system. But the sort of downside to that is if you could end up with a system that for the government of the day, especially if it has a big majority, well, then can I keep tweaking these rules of the road? It may not be for pernicious reasons, but does this sort of constant tweaking then get us to a system that over a longer period of time, the accumulative effect is one of incoherence, right? That's something that we need to consider as well. Now, another set of issues I like to bring up then is also about the presidency being a political office. I think we're a lot more comfortable about in terms of talking about the presidency as a political office today. But there remains some conflation in Singapore when we talk about political and partisan. So the presidency is technically a non-partisan office, right? If you look at the constitution, it says that if you are the president, you have to resign from a political party. You can't be a member of a political party. But that just because you are not a member of a political party doesn't mean that the office or running for that office is not political. If you are running for a political campaign, you're trying to get people to vote for you, and you're trying to gain support across a wide swath of the population, that's political. When you are in the office of the president and you are saying that, well, decisions in terms of who you can appoint as key decision makers, decisions about how you want to deal with the state's, the taxpayers' money, and insofar as that gets to issues of distribution, well, those are political decisions as well. So it's not really possible to shield this office from politics. It is fundamentally political. That's not a bad thing. Sometimes we like to think about politics as pejorative. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It's politics. If you think about politics, it's also how societies figure out how they want to run themselves. So in that respect, politics is, as long as you have a group of people together and they sort of need to find ways of living with each other, that's fundamentally political. Okay, so this gets us to, I think, several of the provisions that were raised in the that was announced as being under review this time around. Now, the first, let me just get my notes there. Okay, so one is the qualification of the elected presidency. Kevin touched on this before. There seemed to be this sort of arbitrary $100 million number, the idea being that, well, if one of the big responsibilities of the president is to look after reserves, then this person has to be able to have the technical expertise and experience to make these kinds of judgments. Well, that may be well and true, but remember, the other thing about the presidency is that it's supposed to be an office that commands moral authority. One of the issues with having these sorts of financial and, I guess, very sort of this sort of experience is harder to attain for ordinary Singaporeans. That the whole point about the 100 million and all the experience about being ministers and all that is to make it an exclusive domain of certain people with these sorts of skills. I can understand from a very technical standpoint why those provisions were put in place. However, you could also get into a situation where in Singapore today, we end up with people who are eligible to be eligible for the top office in the land, who really draw from a very narrow set of experiences. Then, which they have this access to they tend to be people who have access to already high political office or other kinds of public office and wealth. Well, that's not the sort of lived experience that most of us go through. So this raises the question of how representative or how the kinds of moral authority that this president can have, right? Especially if you sort of follow the recent research on Singapore society when we're talking about greater income divide, about perhaps decreasing social mobility. The question that comes up is, would we get into a situation where the presidency is an exclusive domain of really rich people, really connected people that may be disconnected, right, with the rest of us? Some people are comfortable with the idea, other people perhaps less so, and that's something we do have to ponder about as we look toward the review in the Presidential Commission. So, the other safeguard here is, the other provision that the Commission is supposed to look at is to safeguard minority representation, right? All this talk about multiracial Singapore, so on and so forth, which is important, but Singapore's demographic is also changing. If you look at the, I think since population studies since, I think 2010 or so on, basically about 40% of citizen marriages are with non-Singaporeans. These marriages produce children, Their children, may not fall neatly into the CMIO category. There's of course contention about how representative CMIO is, but let's sort of bracket that for now and assume that that's the basis of where we're starting from, right? Even if that sort of Chinese, Malay, Indian, others categorization is our starting point, as our demographics change, what do we then do about minority representation? Would a president that represents the sort of original basis of Singapore's sort of racial makeup, is that sufficient? That's another question that I think is, at least in my mind, unresolved, and I hope that the Commission can resolve. And I mean, there's also the issue of religion, right? After all, the president, the presidency does oversee the Council on a Religious Harmony and appoints the head of that particular council. Now, so far our presidents have been quite low key in their personal life, in their personal and religious life, which I think is a good thing. But if you get a president that happens to be very pious, this is not necessarily a bad thing. But if the president is seen to worship at a particular site quite a lot, what does this mean symbolically for the space of the other religions in relation to the president? These, of course, are questions that may not ultimately be problems, but I think there are issues that do come up in my mind, and I think await better resolution. Okay, so then the sort of last element that I'd like to touch on then is this this idea of a custodial responsibility of the president. Like I said, one of these issues of eligibility has to do with technical and sort of financial experience. But you can, as you think about reasons why an administration may want to use the reserves, these may not be sort of financial considerations. It may not always be an issue of, oh well, we want to invest the reserves in a different way, or we want to move the reserves to some other kind of investment. But it may have to do with very practical things, such as, if there is a major financial crisis, right, and say a lot of people default on their mortgages, and then that gets us to a banking crisis. Well, if you were a sort of more market-oriented person, you may say, okay, maybe you just want to let the market run and let these defaults happen. But that, of course, can have a very big and negative effect on people's and the lives of individuals and families. So sometimes these calls on what you want to do with the money isn't purely a financial call. There may be sort of other concerns that you want to take on board. And in such situations, would a person who has a very strong financial background necessarily be in the best position to make all these other kinds of judgments? That's something that I think is worth considering as well. Okay, so I've gone on for quite a bit. Just let me tie things back together for a moment, and okay, and hopefully it can frame some of our discussion later on. So the way that I've thought about the presidency and areas where the office, right, the institution may be may sort of do well to address concerns would be what I identify as sort of several areas of tension. One is how do we match a need for an administration coming in to be nimble with this need to sort of maintain the status quo, to slow things down, the role that the president is supposed to play, right? Because you can get into a situation where a incoming administration or an incumbent administration has a lot of mandate, has very good reason to want to push for change, including on how we use the reserves, for instance. But you have a president who happens to be very pro-status quo, right? And could that get us into a situation where very good changes, right, or changes that are necessary for society get blocked down, get slowed down too much? That is a concern that I think it's worth thinking about. Another is this issue of discretion versus constraint. So far, the way that we looked at the presidency is, well, in terms of the office has a lot of constraints put on it, including from the Council of Presidential Advisors. Well, what you do with all these constraints is to say that, well, you're limiting the president's autonomy and independence, and sometimes that's for a good reason, because you obviously don't want to sort of run away, an office that sort of runs away and overreaches. But you could also have an issue where the supposed discretion and independence to make a different sort of determination and judgment in order to check what an administration is doing is not effective, right? You may constrain the president too much, and that could potentially be another issue that we should consider as well. And then this, and then I think the last sort of area of tension, which is, and these are all interrelated. The last sort of area of tension, though, that's worth considering is this concept of access and isolation. Because one of the things that we note from the Presidential Elections Commission and also the Council of Presidential Advisors is that there's, the way, while the Constitution allows them to have a staff, the way that they make their decisions is not known to the rest of the citizens. You can say that, well, it's important to sort of, if you think about how a judge or a jury is supposed to work, they're supposed to be in isolation, just think about the case. Maybe that could be good. But at the same time, you could also get into a situation of, well, if it comes to the president or the Council of Presidential Advisors making really important decisions, could they potentially be too isolated from the rest of society to make the right kinds of judgment? That's a sort of other source of concern for me. And I think the last area then that we should perhaps think about is this issue of capability. We sort of assume that, well, the presidency is a very powerful office. It's not powerful, but it's a very symbolic office. It has a very high level of status in our society. Well, that status and all that may be true, but if you think about what the president is supposed to do in terms of looking over the budget and approving the budgets for things like the CPF, the HDB, so on and so forth, these kinds of these budgets, also the president also looks at the budget in general. These kinds of things, they require a lot of time and energy to look at. As you know, with company budgets, they can be very complex animals. So the president, I think, is given 6 months to look at the budgets, but to look at the budgets for the various statutory boards, so on and so forth. But the question is, well, does the president actually have enough personnel to do the kind of due diligence that she is asked to, right? That's another sort of issue that is hanging in my mind that I'm really quite unclear about. And you can see how all these various issues are interrelated. I don't pretend that I have any answer for you. Really what I'm trying to do is to raise issues that can help spur discussion, can help our thinking about what the presidency is, how it relates to the rest of our system of government, and perhaps encourage people to make submissions or sort of take a more active interest and perhaps even role in our political process, right? This whole thing about being active citizens isn't just finding out. If you have one of the ways I see sort of being a responsible citizen is also to sort of raise up and talk about issues that are important to the community as a whole, which is really why I'm doing this. Okay, so I've gone on, the present is very complicated. I've gone on quite a bit. I hope I haven't confused you more than necessary, but I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you.